Hey folks, welcome to our second lecture of week 1 where I want to go over the Bostrom article on the missing pillar in social sustainability. We talked in class about the 3 pillars, the economic, the ecological, and the social dimension of sustainability. And the Bostrom article really wants to focus on the social dimension. It's really important for our class and especially for the themes of a lot of the projects that you'll be working on once you get assigned to your teams and begin that work. So we want to kind of think about all the pillars and how they relate to each other, but the social one maybe has some special importance for our projects, but also important relevance in terms of our maybe special attention on it, trying to make sure that we're doing a good job of keeping it in our focus and incorporating into our courses. So that's why we have this reading for class this week and that we're going to discuss in Wednesday's class meeting and hopefully carry through into our next few discussions coming weeks and into our projects as well. The question that I think we really are asking here is, are the pillars equal? When we're doing some kind of analysis of sustainability, are we taking them into equal account? And the Bostrom article really says, yeah, not so much. In terms of social sustainability, just like the Cates et al. Article argued that sustainable development was a kind of an ambiguous term, sometimes hard to define, even though we're breaking it down into dimensions, the 3 pillars, to try to make it a little bit more tangible. The social dimension is still the one that oftentimes is harder to get a handle on, harder for us to kind of really say what it is and to measure it too, to kind of put it into some kind of either quantitative or qualitative format that would help us. It's an important issue because it means that if we focus on one pillar or 2 pillars more so than another, it can backfire. And there's a lot of examples of this in the literature and in the history of sustainable development efforts. You think about like kind of the classic example of trying to create a national park around an area where there might be a species or a habitat that you want to conserve, and there's a group of people who are dependent on that habitat for their livelihood in some way. You're really creating a negative impact for that community based on your conservation of that particular resource or species or habitat. So you could maybe win on one pillar and lose on another pillar, or put those pillars into conflict with each other. There's a lot of examples of this where unintended consequences happen because you're focusing more so on one aspect of sustainability of the broader environment and not so much on another one. And especially in this time when we're talking a lot about racial and ethnic inequality, class-based inequality is a big hot topic at the moment as well. It's an issue of our time, and one where we really want to think about the ways that how we define, study, make choices about sustainability might have embedded assumptions that are based in structures of privilege and power, and about who gets to make choices about resources and the opportunities that people have or don't have when it comes to using those resources. And historically, the environmental movement, at least in the US, has been a relatively white, middle or upper middle class movement, and it's been critiqued in a lot of cases for that reason, that it didn't take into account the impacts of environmental hazards on communities of color. And we'll get to that a little bit more when we talk about the influence of environmental justice for Bostrom's article. But there's some really important checks that we have to have on how we think about sustainability, what's most important, and how we might actually want to engage with the community. And that's obviously a big aspect of our course, is community engagement via sustainability and environmental issues. So because of that focus, we really want to think about who's the whole community. How does it matter when we're talking about economics and ecology that social dimensions might be impacted in particular projects, particular questions as well. So the Bostrom article really, as I said before, helps us to kind of highlight the difficulty of defining and measuring the social dimension of sustainability. If you think about things that we can quantify in economic terms. It's not always easy to do that. We might actually have to make real difficult choices. We might have to collect a lot of data, have different types of conceptualization that will allow us to put some environmental resource into dollars and cents. Those of you who are environmental economics majors, you know the tools of the trade for doing that kind of work. We also have faculty here who do that kind of work as well. Like a good example I think of is Professor Turner in the economics department has done a lot of research on how you could actually put a value on a dollar and cent value on a national park and the kinds of ways that people value our national park system and how much they would be willing to pay for different amenities or aspects of having that park system. It's not easy to do. You could talk to Professor Turner about the years he spent kind of trying to understand this through research. But at the same time, there is a way that we can actually kind of put a number in some cases on different aspects of those qualities. Same thing with ecologies, the ecological dimension. We know certain things about the way that plants or animals or watersheds or soil systems, geological systems, you name it, there's ways that we can kind of study those in particular terms and have instruments to measure certain things about how many parts per million of some chemical that we don't want in water is there or not there. Professor Seng in environmental studies is one of our campus experts in that topic, that she can take measurements or bring water into her laboratory and make those kinds of assessments. The social dimension sometimes is harder, and that's not to say that we don't actually have really good census data or other forms of data that we can analyze and collect that's about people and how different social structures are really important to understand in terms of sustainability. But we have to make those choices and we have to make those decisions about how to measure them. And part of that challenge then in measurement is definition, which is Bostrom's main argument in this article, that it can be hard to make those choices, or at least they haven't often been a priority of people who do sustainability research. And this is where environmental justice, I think, and environmental justice movements have been really critical in reshaping our attention or turning our attention towards these issues of power, privilege, injustice, inequity that I mentioned on the prior slide, and especially when it comes to issues related to race and ethnicity, class, gender dimensions, ways that we can kind of divide up people along lines of identity and exclusion. How do those matter in terms of things like who gets the environmental goods, who gets the environmental bads, what kinds of choices do we make around sustainability, as I was saying on the prior slide. And so Bostrom actually talks about a few different elements of social sustainability through the lens of environmental justice concepts. So again, a good example of where we hit a roadblock maybe with a particular concept and think it's too broad. We don't know how to define it. We can't figure it out. So what do? We dive down. We try to find the dimensions and subdimensions of that concept that really help us get a better handle on it and make it a tool that we can actually do research and analysis with. So some of the key terms that come from the EJ literature that Bostrom mentions are things like how are environmental goods distributed or environmental bads distributed, and to what extent do people have a participatory role in the decision-making processes in government, in consumer choices and so forth around environmental goods or bads. And how does that matter, again, along the lines of race, ethnicity, class, gender, so forth. The substantive and the procedural dimensions as well are important EJ concepts that help us kind of see, like, to what extent are there actual tangible things that we can point to, or the kind of like how the processes that would help us understand the way that social dimensions are important for sustainability. And then also just the importance of social change and the fact that, again, as I was saying in the case of, say, forest conservation or some species preservation, keeping things the same isn't necessarily always a good thing for everybody. For people who are subject to inequality and injustice, social change is an important goal. And so we have to kind of think about what our goals are, who we are, and whether or not everyone's a part of that process. One thing that is not as emphasized in Bostrom, but I think is going to be a really important element of our work in this course, is the influence of community-based research methods. And ideally, in CBR methods, we really bring the community into the process of helping us develop our questions, our methods, our approaches. And that's one way of trying to, you could say, kind of have a procedural aspect, a participatory aspect, to use those terms from EJ, that would help us get around these challenges of defining, implementing social dimension in sustainability work. Okay, so with that quick overview, here's a couple of discussion questions that we can bring into class on Wednesday and maybe carry forward with some of our other topics that we're going to consider in coming weeks as well. Examples of how we can define social sustainability. Examples from Bostrom, examples that you've maybe seen in other coursework or other case studies that you've looked at. Are there ways that we can define social sustainability? We've talked about how it's a challenge, but how do we actually do it? There's some examples that I gave you on the last slide from the concepts in environmental justice and other aspects of Bostrom's article, but there might be other examples as well. And again, this is kind of a similar question to one that I raised for class last time. If we're going to actually be doing this work, going into the community, trying to develop some proposals for a particular research question, how can we incorporate social sustainability? What might be some of the opportunities or challenges that we'd face doing that here in our community, on campus, in Hamilton, in central New York? What might we run into? Those are some things we can talk about for class on Wednesday, and I'll see you then. Thanks.